Howdy folks, Dave here at Thunder Mesa Studio, where today we're picking up right where we left off last time, building some bench work for my little slice of Colorado, the HOn3 Barlow Pass layout. In the first installment, I built a sturdy stand to support the entire layout using some metal shelves that I already had on hand and adding some casters to the bottom so the whole layout can move if I needed to. And today I want to start on the bench work for the layout itself. That's the physical frame that all of the roadbed and track and scenery and structures will be built on top of. And since we're going to be modeling Colorado with its tall mountains and deep canyons and steep winding grades, I'm going to be using an open frame box girder design. That's really the best method that I've found to model this kind of scenery. Much better than, a flat tabletop with everything built up on top of it. An open frame box girder design allows you to build scenery both above and below track level, making for a much more interesting looking layout and a much more realistic representation of some place like southwestern Colorado. Now, as always for me, this kind of project starts with a plan on paper. So let's take a look at the plan I came up with for this box frame. All right. I've decided to use 1x3 lumber for the box frame just to keep the weight down on everything. As you can see, it's just a pretty simple box. I've got some triangular cleats here indicated for the corners to strengthen those. This is the frame that I already built down here, indicated here. This is the top of the stand. So as you can see, the layout itself is going to hang over by about 10 or 11 inches on each side. This area right here is interesting because this has to drop down about 7 inches lower than the main box frame, and I've got all those calculations written out down here. And this is for Lonesome Gorge, that deep canyon. It's going to have the metal trestle bridge across it. I wanted a canyon that's about 100 feet deep, so I need to drop this part of the box frame down a little bit. Okay, I think I have all the lumber I need to build this on hand, so let's go home to my workshop and start putting this thing together. Once again, I've got some 1x3 pine boards from my local home center, and right now I'm just trying to find the straightest one because that will act as the back side of the box frame. I opted for a little bit lower quality lumber this time. Didn't need to spend the extra money on select pine because none of this is really going to show when the layout's finished. So I don't mind a few knots and imperfections and things like that as long as the board is straight. And this one looks like about the best so far. Okay, we have a winner here. This will be the back strap of our frame, and the entire thing is going to be 96 inches long by 44 inches wide. Now our back strap piece is already 96 inches long. I measured it and it's right on there. So I'm going to need 3 cross pieces right off the bat. That'll be 42.5, and then with a 1x3 on each side, that will total 44 inches. Because, 1x lumber is actually 3/4 of an inch and not an inch. So 2 of them together is 1.5 inches. You get the math. By the way, you should always check your saw with a square that you trust. Just because it says 0 right there on one of these adjustable chop saws does not mean that's actually 0 degrees. In fact, it's off by quite a bit. Let me adjust this over here. It's off by about a whole degree there. $42.5, right on the button. Now we'll get another one that's pretty much exactly the same length. Now for the front, I want a board that's 48 3/8. That way it'll allow for that 1x3 brace. And that'll be about half the length of the entire layout. This piece is kind of ugly, but I think it'll be okay. There. Put an F on that for front so I don't forget. Here's where we're at so far. And before I start cutting the rest of the pieces to go on this end, I think we'll go ahead and put all this together so I can get some real precise measurements for the rest of the box frame. Now the first corner on something like this is always the trickiest. So, to tilt the odds in my favor, I'm using a framing square, lining up both boards. And once again, to assemble everything, I'm going to be using some 1 1/4 inch wood screws, interior wood screws, and some wood glue. Line that up. Now, a lot of you learned in, first year wood shop that putting fasteners into the end grain makes for a weak joint. I'm not disputing that. That is absolutely true. It does make for a weaker joint. However, I'm not building a house here. This is not going to hold that much weight. I've been doing it this way for years and years, and I've never had one of these joints separate when I didn't want it to. That said, I'm also going to be using triangular gussets at the corners for extra strength. Now I want to come around and do this side using all the same precautions. This will be the front edge of the layout now. Got my framing square in place, and we'll drill a couple of pilot holes. And we'll drive in a couple of screws. If I did that right, this should be 44 inches. Look at that. It's almost like I know what I'm doing. Almost. Now I'll put this middle board in. I don't know if you can see this, but this board is about a 1/16 of an inch wider than these other boards, which is something that sometimes happens with these common pine boards that you can get at your local Walmart of wood. But it's not mission critical here that they be exactly the same height. If I had a planer here, I could fix that, but I don't have a planer here in the shop, so we're just going to live with it in the knowledge that it's all going to be hidden under scenery. Okay, so far so good. Now, put in the middle piece, lining that up right at 24 inches on center. Now with this part assembled, I can get some precise measurements and cut these 3 pieces. 1, 2, 3. So that's going to be 47 5/8. Just what I thought it would be. That's going to go right there. So then I'll need 2 pieces that are 30 and 1/2 inches. Now I need to measure, cut, and install all of these lateral braces. And these are important because they serve a couple of functions. One is they help to align it and attach it to the stand that I've already built. And they're also going to be attachment points for the risers for the plywood sub-roadbed that I'll be adding later. Now I want to turn the whole thing upside down because I'm going to add these triangular corner gussets, which I cut from some 1/8 inch plywood. And for these, I'm just going to use some wood glue and some box nails. Now I just need to build this drop-down section here that will become the bottom of Lonesome Gorge. Okay, well now I can install this entire contraption on its stand back at the studio. Make sure it's centered on here. Now I can attach the box frame to the stand. I'm going to use 4 screws on each side, 1, 2, 3, 4, coming up from the bottom through this L girder and into the frame. This method has worked really well on the Thunder Mesa layout over the years, so I don't see any reason not to use it again. This is where having the thing on rollers comes in handy. Okay, well, hopefully that's the last of the crawling around on the ground for a little while. Okay, well, that's the box frame finished and installed, and that's kind of a major milestone. But now I can concentrate on the sub-roadbed, and for that, I'm going to need a 4x8 sheet of 1/2 inch plywood. Okay, I've got my sheet of plywood here. So the next challenge is going to be blowing up the track plan from my drawing to full size on this surface. I've got a few tools here of the measuring and marking variety to make this job go a little bit more smoothly. Pencil, of course, measuring tape, bar compass, very handy item for drawing out those curves, straight edge, and a framing square. Now, just like when I do my drawings on paper, when I blow it up to full size, I want to start with the curves. So I need to find the exact center of these curves so I can measure out the proper radius. And it looks like we've got 21 inches from that side and 22 inches from the back side. So I can take those two measurements and find that exact spot on my plywood. Using my framing square, that looks like dead center of that curve right there. Now I can adjust my bar compass to that 19-inch radius. That's pretty good right there. And we'll draw in that first curve. Always go a little bit beyond the beginning and end of the curve, and I can fix those lines up later on. I got one more sweeping curve here where the line goes down to connect to staging, and I've determined the center point is right there. 17.5 inches from that side and 27 inches in from that side. 17, what did I say? 17.5. Right there. Now I can start connecting up these loops. I'll find where the straight sections are. I got a straight one right here, goes in that tunnel, and how we can locate it on here. Put a straight edge against that. So, make a mark out there and a mark up here, and then we just measure in from each end and find out where that imaginary line would cross the edges of our sheet of plywood. If I measured that right, it should line up within, oh gosh, about a 1/4 inch of that curve I just drew. Looks like we did okay. Now I've got another straight coming off the end of this curve, and I did pretty much the same thing again. You know, drawing out that imaginary line, measuring out where the endpoints would be on the edges of the plywood. So I can take that right across like that. Now I can start getting rid of some of these extra lines I'm not going to need, just to avoid confusion later on. And that's basically how I do it, you know, just little by little, adding each line and, you know, stitching everything together, stitching the straights in with the curves. But now I want to start adding where the turnouts are, because this is a very important junction over here. This is Elk Park Junction, very important to operations of the railroad, and I've got a little something extra to help me with this. So I've printed out and then cut out full-size templates for all of the turnouts I'm going to need. And you can download these templates for free off of the Fast Tracks website. I'll put a link there so you can check them out. And these are the exact same dimensions as the custom-built turnouts that I have received from Empire Trackworks, sponsor of this build. So I'm going to use these directly on the sub-roadbed here, so I'll have a very accurate placement for all these turnouts. I'll start with this first left-hand turnout back here, and I'm just going to Scotch tape it right over that center line. And that tells me exactly where that diverging route's going to come out. And I can take my straight edge and draw that in. Another tool I highly recommend is a flexible curve. These are sold by, drafting supply companies, good art supply stores. Graphic artists use them, architects use them, draftsmen, at least back in the old days when we drew everything by hand. I don't recommend it for doing large curves, but for small little connecting pieces like this, where the track radius is not critical, it's ideal. It's not marked precisely on the plan, but this is meant to be a 24-inch radius curve right here, where this little trestle over Fickle Creek is going to be located. Okay, that's the whole reverse loop. In fact, that's everything except for the town of Barlow Pass itself. Now, in my plan, the town of Barlow Pass sits directly above the back half of the reverse loop. So how do we do that with one sheet of plywood? Well, I actually figured it all out on paper, and it is possible to cut all of the pieces I need out of one 4x8 sheet. However, it would mean dividing the roadbed up into several sections in order to make that work. And I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to have it to be as contiguous as possible, so we'll have a nice smooth grade throughout. So what I decided to do was just get another quarter sheet of plywood that will sit on top here and be the town of Barlow Pass. And we're going to clamp it down on here and draw the whole thing out right on top of this. So now I can just have one joint in the sub-roadbed right here, which is right near the top of the grade, rather than several scattered throughout the layout. So those parallel tracks in town, right about there. Putting the parallel tracks on 2-inch centers, which is pretty generous for HOn3. But I like to be able to get my hands up here in between in between the rail cars. Yeah, at scale, the parallel tracks would be closer together, but you have to make allowances for fat human fingers. The next thing I want to do is locate the center point for the turntable. I can draw that in. We need to cut that circle out. And I need a circle that's about 9 1/16 in diameter. And I'm going to need another right-hand turnout right here. It goes up to the track behind the coaling tower. Now I'll just finish up the turntable lead. That's really all the track I need to draw in right now. Now I can start drawing in all of the cut lines, going about 1 inch to 1.5 inches outside that track center line. And up here, I want to keep a lot of this plywood because this is where the stock pens are going to be located. And the curves are real easy. Just readjust my compass to an outside diameter that's 1.5 inches bigger, and then go again 1.5 inches smaller. And we've got our cut lines. Then I like to go back over all of my cut lines with a Sharpie, because I find that makes them a lot easier to see when I'm cutting everything out with a jigsaw, which is exactly what we're going to be doing next. I got my jigsaw set up with a brand new blade, so let's get this done. went about as well as could be expected. Okay, I'm just going to clean up in here a little bit, then we'll take everything up to the studio and see how it all fits on the Benchwork. Well, everything fits the way it's supposed to. So the next step will be to cut some risers to create the grades and to elevate the sub-roadbed up above the box frame. But before we do that, let's have a little refresher on how to calculate those grades and what all those numbers mean. The plan as it's drawn calls for a 3% grade. So what does that mean? What does 3% grade or 4% or 2% mean? Well, imagine this is the graph. This is 0, okay? And this is 90 degrees, straight up and down. So imagine an arc going like this, from 90 degrees down to 0. And so what that percentage is calling out is what piece of that arc we're talking about. So, 50% would be here. This would be 100%, obviously. This would be a 0% grade. So 3% grade would be right about there, right? There is a simpler way to do it for our model building needs. And that's to think of it this way. A 3% grade would be a rise of 3 inches within 100 inches, right? It's not exactly the same. It's microscopically off from what it would, accurately be doing it this way, but it's close enough for model railroad work. So if a 3% grade rises 3 inches in 100 inches, that means it would only rise 1.5 inches in 50 inches and 3/4 of an inch in 25 inches, right? I like to break it down that way because you're going to be putting risers at optimal spacing on your layout. So every 25 inches, which is right around 2 feet, is a good place to put those risers. So we start at 0, and then 25 inches down the line from that would be 3/4 of an inch if we're going up, right? And then another 25 inches from there would be 1.5 inches, and so on and so forth. Of course, I already calculated the grade on the plan, right? But it's a really good idea to go back now to the sub-roadbed we just cut and the Benchwork and calculate it again in full scale to make sure that there aren't any unpleasant surprises. Now here on the Barlow Pass layout, not only do we have a grade, but we have tracks passing over other tracks. So we have an issue of clearance there. We have to have enough clearance between the bottom track and the one passing over the top. And there are several factors at play there that we need to consider. See right here, the tracks in the town of Barlow pass directly over the tracks going through Flat Top Tunnel right here. So if, just for the sake of discussion, this is 0 elevation here, and this is 4-inch elevation on the top of this, well, the space you actually have between the two is 3.5 inches because this roadbed is 1/2 inch thick. And there's another thing we need to worry about. What modelers will sometimes do is, measure their tallest piece of equipment and then think that's how much clearance they need, that plus maybe 1/16 of an inch. One thing I seldom hear discussed is the height of track and roadbed. You need to add the height of the track and the roadbed to the height of the equipment to get an accurate number. If you don't do that, you're not going to have good clearance. So here I have a Denver and Rio Grande Western caboose, which will be probably the tallest piece of equipment I run on the Barlow Pass, and I have it sitting on a piece of this Blackstone sectional track to give me an idea of exactly how much clearance I'm going to need here in the real world. And to the top of that smoke jack, it's exactly 2.5 inches. So we need about, I would like to have 2 5/8 inches of clearance at a bare minimum. So back to our example over here, again, if this is 0 elevation here, this can be as low as 3 1/8 inch tall, and that'll give us that 2 5/8 inches of clearance, allowing for the 1/2 inch thick sub-roadbed. So what that means is that on the drawn plan, I gave myself more clearance than I actually need, and that's pretty rare. That's also good news because it means I can ease that grade even more. I tested the equipment on a 3% grade and it operated fine, but I know everything will operate even better on maybe a 2.5% grade. So we're going to do the same thing that real world railroads do. We're going to ease that grade as much as possible to make it easier on the locomotives and equipment. So let's figure this out right now on this climb up to Barlow Pass. So starting at this point inside the tunnel right here, I'm going to mark this as our 0 elevation. Okay, and then this continues at 0 elevation all the way around under the town. Now I have a compass here that I've adjusted to 1 inch, right? And I'm going to use that like a pair of dividers. We'll start at our 0 elevation. We're going to just count up to 25. 1, 2, 3, 4, 23, 24, 25. So this point right here at Elk Park Junction, that is going to be 5/8 of an inch right there. Because if we're doing a 2.5% grade, it's going to rise 5/8 of an inch every 25 inches. And now we just continue on. Same thing. We count out another 25 inches. 1, 2, 3, 24, and 25. Mark that. And that will be 1 1/4 inch of elevation. I'll just continue on around the corner, counting out another 25 inches. 2, 3, 4, and that should be 1 7/8. You're getting the idea, right? 22, 23, 24, 25. And that should bring us up to 2.5 inches. 23, 24, 25. And that should bring us right to the top of the grade. And what did I say it needed to be? 3 1/8 inches. Perfect. Now here where the track from the staging yard passes underneath the trestle, I'm going to keep this at about a 3% grade so I can have adequate clearance. Now with all of those calculations done, I have all the information I need to cut and place all of the risers in the proper locations at the proper heights. Now to measure for my risers, I need to go to the bottom of the box frame here because that's where they're going to attach. And the bottom there is 40.5 inches. And I want my base track level, 0-inch track level, to be 50 inches above the floor. So that means I need to cut some risers that are 9.5 inches long. Now, positioning the first few is always a little bit tricky. Make sure I have plenty of clamps within easy reach. And I want to make sure these are all going up at a 90-degree angle. And while I'm working on that end, I'm going to prop up this in temporarily with these apple boxes. Then I use my big level, make sure everything stays aligned where it's supposed to be with the edges of the box frame. Making sure that everything is still properly aligned, I can start connecting the sub-roadbed with a couple of screws straight down through the top. Always try to torque those screws down so they're flush with the top of the sub-roadbed. If I have to put screws anywhere through where the track will actually be, I'll actually countersink the screw holes. All right, well, that should do it for the zero elevation, and now we start to climb up the hill. We're starting to gain elevation now, so the next riser is going to be 9.5 plus 5/8 of an inch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, and 1/8. Here we have an interesting situation where I don't have anything to attach this riser to. I want it to be positioned directly under that line that I drew on the sub-roadbed. And so my solution here is to add a little bridge across here with a piece of 1x2, and that will give me something to attach this riser to. Before I put the intermediate risers in around the curve back there, I want to bring this piece of the sub-roadbed up to its final level. This is the top of the grade right here. And the reason I want to do that now is because, as you can see, this plywood is very flexible. It moves around a lot. So I want to make sure it is properly positioned before I put the rest of those risers in. So right here we've got a 2.5 inch elevation mark. So let's see, 9.5 plus 2.5 inches, that's 12 inches last time I checked. So we need a 12-inch riser right there. I usually like to put that first screw in and check the square again. Make sure we're still where we need to be. You can see that that elevation line right there is pretty much directly lined up with our riser, and that's exactly what we want. We want that right in the middle as much as we can get it that way. And the next riser is 12 5/8. And that'll bring us right to the tip top of that 2.5% grade. Now, if all of my calculations are correct, this should be 3 1/8 inch higher here than here. You know what? I don't know if you can see that, but that's pretty spot on. And now I can go ahead and install the intermediate risers in the curve back here. Well, now that all of the primary elevation risers are in, I'm just going back and filling in here and there where needed to make everything just a little bit more rigid, because I don't want the plywood to be flapping around at all. You might notice I ran out of those pretty wood screws, so back to good old drywall screws. It's a tradition here at Thunder Mesa Studio, and as a wise man once remarked, the wood doesn't care. Now I'm installing a plywood cleat, which will help connect this piece of sub-roadbed to the piece that will be under the town of Barlow Pass. You should have just enough room here for this, not interfere with trains passing through the tunnel down below. In this instance, I'm going to install most of the risers first, and then we'll put the roadbed down on top of them. Here goes nothing. Well, it's probably a good idea to check the level at this point. Oh, that looks excellent. How about this way? Spot on. Love it. Let's check the clearance. Clarence, get our caboose on here and see how we did. Oh, look at that. I love it when a plan comes together. Now I just need to finish up the risers for this short section of track that'll go down to staging. This is actually an inch lower than the 0 elevation of the rest of the track, so I've marked it as -1. Well, now you can see what I was talking about with this open box frame design being ideal for modeling dramatic scenery with lots of vertical separations. Perfect, in fact, for the rugged mountains of southwestern Colorado. Look at all this room we have above and below track level for scenery. Now, eventually, this section of the roadbed here and this section here are going to be cut away and replaced with some very dramatic bridges that I have planned. But I'm afraid all of that is going to have to be a project for another day. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today for this installment of the HOn3 Barlow Pass layout build. And I have a couple of quick notes before we sign off. First, a huge thank you to Empire Trackworks for providing the beautiful custom-built HOn3 turnouts that I'm going to be using on this layout. Whatever scale you model, you should check out their website. That's empire-trackworks.com for wonderful custom-built turnouts. Check them out. Also, I'm not going to be around for the next month. I'm going on a little hiatus, going to be on the road for the entire month of July. So I'm sorry there probably won't be any videos during that month, but I'm looking forward to coming back in August and getting back to work on the Barlow Pass layout, the Thunder Mesa layout, and everything else I've got going on here in the studio. So I hope you are subscribed with those notifications turned on so you won't miss that stuff. In the meantime, you can also follow over on Patreon for free. That's patreon.com/thundermesa or on Instagram at thunder.mesa. And I hope you'll check out the resources available on the Thunder Mesa Studio website. That's thundermesa.studio. As always, a huge thank you to our Patreon members who help to make these projects and these videos possible. Until next time, keep moving forward, my friends. Adios for now.